Hey everybody, in this video we're going to talk about how tables and graphs can be used to help summarize the patterns that your students are noticing and how you can use tables and graphs to help them understand even more about those patterns. So the basic idea of any function is that you have two variables that are related to each other. So this could be two variables from the input and output game or the function game I explained in the last video. But it can also be other things that they may not think of as inputs and outputs. So, for example, if we look at the penny jar situation, where you have a penny jar that starts with 2 pennies, and on each day you add 3 pennies, and you ask the students how many pennies are in the jar on a specific day, the students aren't necessarily going to think about this in terms of independent and dependent variables. In this situation, the day number, which is one of your variables, is the independent variable. And then the number of pennies is the dependent variable because the number of pennies depends on which day you're at and how many days you've been adding pennies. So the pennies would be dependent and the day number would be independent. But it's not necessarily helpful to make the students identify those variables um, at the beginning of solving a problem like this. Instead, it would be more productive to let them play with it. So you might tell them you can use blocks, you can use counters, you can use a piece of paper if you want to draw pictures, you can use equations. Use whatever method you want to use to figure out how many pennies are going to be in the jar on some day that you choose. And maybe you might have them split up into groups and you might say, in your group, you guys are going to figure out how many pennies would be in the jar on day 5. And in this group, you guys are going to figure out how many pennies are going to be in the jar on day 7. And you would give each group maybe a different number and let them work and let them figure out their own strategies for how they would figure it out. And then when you come back together, then you can summarize their results in a table. And this would be a really good way to introduce the idea of using tables because even though tables are really intuitive for us as adults, the process of like using the two columns to represent the variables is not necessarily intuitive for students. So if you let them interact with the problem first and then summarize their results in a table, it will start to help them understand how tables can be used. So in this case, you might summarize it and you'd say, okay, there's two things that are changing here. We have different day numbers, and then each day you're going to have a different number of pennies. So let's record how many pennies you have for each day. And so maybe you go to the first group and you say, okay, you guys were assigned to figure out how many pennies are in the jar on day 3. How did you guys figure out your, um, like the number of pennies? And maybe they used blocks, maybe they used equations, like whatever method they used, you can ask them and let them explain it. And then you can record the number of pennies that are in the jar on that day. And so I think in this case, it would be 11 pennies. So you could write that down. And maybe you go to the next group, and maybe this group used an equation to figure out how many pennies were in the jar on day 7. And maybe their equation is that they did 2 pennies plus 7 threes because you added 3 pennies every day. And when they do that, I think the answer would be 23 pennies. So you could write down that result. And then maybe another group did it for 9 pennies. And what they figured out was that it would be 29 pennies per day or for that day. And you could use this table to summarize all of their different results. And one thing that can also be really helpful with tables is if you have the independent variable increasing in increments of 1. So, like in this case, I kind of skipped around and I went from day 3 to day 7 to day 9. But if you had enough group members that you could assign day 1 and day 2 and day 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8, and you recorded all of those results, then the students will start to notice patterns in the table as well, because the pattern will show that you just take the previous day number and add 3 to it. So that's one way that you can introduce the idea of tables. And then another way that you could also represent the same situation is with a tape or with a graph. And so you could say, all right, let's have the x-axis represent the day number, and let's have the y-axis represent the number of pennies. And then you could say, okay, well, on day 0, we have 2 pennies, so that could be represented by this point. On day 1, we have 3 more pennies than that, which would be 5, so that would be this point. And you would need to go through and explicitly explain to the students how a coordinate plane is essentially 2 intersecting number lines, and the points on the graph paper kind of represent both points at once. So, like on day 1, if you have 5 pennies, you look for where those two number lines kind of intersect, or those two places on the number lines intersect. And that point represents that on day 1, you would have 5 pennies. And usually we put the independent variable on the x-axis and the dependent variable on the y-axis. Um, and the reasoning for that is just because with functional notation, we always use the y-axis to represent the output, and the output always depends on what you input. So that's just kind of getting them ready for high school. But this is just like a convention that mathematicians have settled on. It doesn't have to be this way. Like technically, you could switch the day number and the penny number to be on different axes, and the graph that would be produced would still represent the situation. It just wouldn't be in the way that mathematicians typically represent functions. But when you're first introducing this to your students, it's fine to let them choose to put it on either axis. And you can actually have some really good conversations about like why it matters, which axis you would put it on, because the pictures of the graphs that you'll get would be different depending on which axis you have them on. And you can use that discussion as an opportunity to explain to them what the mathematical conventions are that mathematicians have just decided to land on. But that's much more meaningful than telling them, oh, like the independent variable has to be on the x-axis. Which one is the independent variable? And like spending a lot of time focusing on the notation of it is not necessarily very productive when the main thing they should be focusing on is looking for the patterns and representing the patterns using graphs. And then if you have some students who put the day on the x-axis and the pennies on the y-axis, and others who flip-flop them, then you can have a meaningful discussion about how the labeling of your graph makes a difference in the graph that's produced. But technically, both graphs still represent the situation, just in a different way. So, as you're introducing this idea of tables and graphs to your students, remember that the goal should be to use tables and graphs as a tool to help you understand patterns more. The goal is not to take patterns and convert them into tables and graphs. Even if it is part of your objective of your lesson to help your students understand how to create tables and graphs, they should always be introduced as a tool to summarize the thought processes that your students are already having. Because we don't want the focus to just be on this is how you take a word problem and represent it in a table. Instead, it should be more along the lines of I wonder if we could use a table to help us understand this problem more. So you're using them as tools, not as the end objective, because the end objective should ultimately be that the students can figure out multiple different ways to represent the patterns that they're observing. So I hope this video was helpful. If you have any questions, let me know, and I hope you guys have a great day.